News of the times. Spectral evidence. The chilling case of Anne Walker's ghost. A Notorious November episode. Today we bring you a case that reads like gothic fiction, and yet every word of it was once treated as fact. In 17th century County Durham, the body of a young woman was found buried in a shallow grave, her fate unknown, until a ghost appeared, not just once, but repeatedly. She named her killer, she described the crime, and incredibly, the legal system of the day listened. This is the true story of Anne Walker, a servant girl whose tragic end shocked her local community and whose ghostly testimony sparked one of the most unusual murder trials in British history. In an age before forensics and long before Victorian logic reigned, spectral evidence, that is, evidence from beyond the grave, was not only believed by the public, but by the courts. We're diving into a time when ghost stories didn't just unsettle people, they shaped verdicts. Was it justice, superstition, or a desperate grasp for truth in the absence of science? As part of our Notorious November series, this case brings us to the eerie edge of early British justice, where fact and folklore walked hand in hand, and where the dead could still speak. And stick around after the main case for today's further particulars, in which a Welsh clergyman, a suspicious reaper, and a mysterious silent horseman all converge in what may be the most polite divine intervention on record. One word is spoken, one sickle is sheathed, and one man may have been saved by a ghost with excellent timing. So, grab something warm, draw the curtains tight, and make sure that that cupboard door is definitely closed. Leave the lights low, but not too low, and settle in for a tale where justice may have not come from Scotland Yard, but from beyond the Vale. In the early decades of the 17th century, County Durham lay in the rugged borderlands of northern England, hills rising westwards into the Pennines, meandering rivers like the Wear and the Tees cutting through laird farmland, and forests still clinging to older ways of life. The visual impression was one of small hamlets scattered across moor and dale, of villagers tied closely to the land and bound by custom. Exact population figures for the County of Durham at this date are impossible to state with certainty. Parish records are patchy, but for context, England and Wales together were estimated at around 5.2 million people in 1630. In a county such as Durham, then mostly rural and agricultural, communities of a few hundred people living close to each other in village clusters would have been common. The population density was low by later standards, and many inhabitants would have considered themselves tied to farm work, tenant labour, or small-scale crafts. Daily life and labour. For most people, life was defined by the seasons: ploughing, sowing, harvesting, sheep shearing, moving livestock to summer pastures, all framed the year. Hearth and home were modest: one or two rooms, open fires, earthen floors or flagstones, and thick clothing to battle the northern chill. Religion was central, as was deferences to the patterns of tradition and authority, whether to the parish minister, the squire, or the local magnate. Illness, death, and accident were ever present. The boundary between life and loss was thin. The geography reinforced a sense of isolation and risk. Deep valleys, wooded slopes, hedged meadows, and long stretches of moor where mist would gather and dusk come early in the year. Travel might mean walking a half-mile to the stile or crossing fields to meet at a gate. This settling matters for our story, the interplay of darkness, solitude, hidden places, and the boundary between human habitation and wild land sets the stage for what was at once normal and uncanny. In short, when we talk about the murder of Anne Walker in 17th century Durham, we're talking about a world where a ghostly testimony might indeed be taken seriously, because society, landscape, and belief combine to make the extraordinary feel plausible. The houses were not yet sprawling mansions, the population was modest but rooted, and the land itself carried the weight of custom, deference, and the unseen. Before we begin, let's take a moment to understand how a ghost could name her own murderer and be believed. We need to step back into the world of the 1630s in England, a time when the line between life and death was thought to be far thinner than it is today. This was an age steeped in religious certainty and supernatural fear. Ghosts were not seen as metaphor or myth. They were often regarded as troubled souls with unfinished business, sometimes even divine messengers. To encounter a spectre was not considered fantastical, but deeply serious. The successor to Queen Elizabeth I, King James I, who had died just 5 years before this case, had been personally obsessed with witches and the supernatural. He'd even authored a treatise on the subject, Demonology, a work that not only affirmed the reality of witchcraft, demons, and ghostly visitations, but shaped the very laws of the land. His influence lingered. Witch trials were still very much a part of public life. People believed that evil could be done through supernatural means, and that justice might require listening to the voices of the dead. In this atmosphere, spectral testimony wasn't dismissed as mere superstition. It was part of a larger cosmology, a way to explain the unexplainable. If a murdered soul returned with a warning or a name, it was seen not just as possible, but as divinely permitted. And so, when the ghost of a servant girl appeared on a country road and began to speak, people listened. A word on the source of this tale. The story you're about to hear was recorded by an 18th century writer who, in his own words, feared being ridiculed for collecting such tales, knowing full well that the wits of the age held deep contempt for ghost stories or anything supernatural. And yet, he was convinced this case was different. The details were too specific, the documents too compelling, and the misreporting by other writers, he warned, risked burying the truth beneath layers of error. I thought, he wrote, I could not do a greater service to the public than to preserve it in its genuine purity. What follows is his account, recorded directly from period documents and testimonies, with not so much as a single letter changed. From the lives of the most remarkable criminals who have been condemned and executed for murder, an account of the conviction and execution of Mr. Walker and Mark Sharp for the murder of Anne Walker. About the year 1631, there lived in a place called Chesterley Street in the county Palatine of Durham a one Mr. Walker, a yeoman of good fortune and credit. He was a widower and kept a young woman, one Anne Walker, a relation of his, in his house as housekeeper. It was suspected, it seems, by some of the neighbours that she was with child, immediately upon which she was removed to one Dame Cares, an aunt of hers in the town of Lumley hard by. The old woman treated her with much kindness and civility, but was exceedingly earnest to know of her who was the father of the child with which she went. But the young woman constantly avoided answering that question. But at last, perceiving how uneasy the old woman was because she could get no knowledge how the poor babe was to be provided for, this Anne Walker at last said that he who got her with child would take care of both her and it, with answers her aunt was tolerably satisfied. Some time after, of an evening, her old master Walker and one Mark Sharp, with whom he was extraordinarily intimate, came to her aunt's house and took the said Anne Walker away. About a fortnight passed without her being seen or heard of, and without much talk of the neighbourhood concerning her, supposing she had been carried somewhere to be privately brought to bed in order to escape her shame. But one James Graham, a miller who lived 2 miles from the place where Walker's house was, being one night between the hours of 12 and 1 grinding corn in his mill, and the mill door shut, as he came downstairs from putting corn into the hopper, he saw a woman standing in the middle of the floor, with her hair all bloody, hanging about her ears, and 5 large wounds in her head. Graham thought, although he was a bold man, was exceedingly shocked at this spectacle. At last, after calling upon God to protect him, he, in a low voice, demanded who she was and what she wanted of him. To which the woman made answer, I am the spirit of Anne Walker, who lived with Walker at Chester in the street, and being got with child by him, he promised to send me to a private space where I could be well looked after until I was brought to bed and well again, and then I should come to him again and keep his house. And I was accordingly late one night sent away with Mark Sharp, who upon the moor just by the yellow bankhead slew me with a pick, an instrument wherewith they dig coals, and gave me these 5 wounds, and afterwards threw me into a coal pit hard by, and hid the pick under the bank. His shoes and stockings also being blooded, he endeavoured to wash them, but seeing the blood would not go forth, he hid them there too. And now, James Grime, so the country people pronounce Graham, I am come to you that by revealing this bloody act, my murderers may be brought to justice, which unless you do, I will continually pursue and haunt you. The miller returned home to his house very melancholy, and much astonished at this sight, yet he held his peace, hoping that if he did not reveal it, she would go to somebody else. He was fearful of blasting the character of Mr. Walker, who was a man of substance, by telling such a tale concerning him to a justice of the peace. However, he avoided as much as he was able being in the mill alone, especially at nights. But notwithstanding all his care, and though other persons were not far off, she appeared to him there again, and in a harsh tone demanded why he had not made known what she had spoken to him. He made her no answer, but fled to the other end of the place where the people were. Yet, some little time after, just after sunset, she met him in his own garden, and spoke to him with such cruel aspect and with such fearful threats that he promised to go the next morning to a magistrate, which he accordingly did. On the morrow, being St. Thomas's Day, he applied to a justice of the peace and told him the story. The justice, having tendered him his oath and taking his information in writing, forthwith issued his warrant, and he apprehended Mr. Walker and Mr. Mark Sharp, who by trade was a collier, i.e. he dug coals out of a mine. They made light of the thing before the justice, although he in the meanwhile had caused a place which Graham said the apparition had spoken of to be searched, and there they found the dead body, wounded in place and manner as before described, with the pick, the shoes, and the stockings. However, Walker and Sharp were admitted to bail, and at the next assizes appeared upon their trial. Judge Davenport heard the several circumstances of the woman's being carried out by Sharp, her being suspected to be with child by her master Walker, and the story which Graham repeated exactly upon oath as he had done before the justice. The foreman of the jury did dispose that he saw a child standing upon the shoulders of the prisoner Walker at the bar, and the judge himself was under such a concern and unease that as soon as the jury had found the prisoners guilty, he immediately rose up and passed sentence of death upon them, a thing never known before nor since in Durham, the custom being not to pass sentence until the close of the assizes. Walker and Sharp were found guilty at the Durham assizes in 1631 and were executed shortly afterwards, although the precise date of their hanging has long since faded into the silence of the archives. In their world, the notion that a murdered soul might rise from the grave to demand justice was not only plausible, it was expected. From the murk of the medieval to the parlours of the Victorian age, Britain's courts and communities often turned to the uncanny for answers. A corpse that bled when touched by the guilty, a ghost that whispered truths no living witness could know. Justice was sometimes sought in candlelight and rendered in shadows. Anne Walker's spirit, so the tale goes, returned not once but many times. She named her killer, she described the deed, and in a society where belief ran deeper than evidence, her voice carried weight. The lines between fact and folklore were porous. The moors of County Durham, with their long silences and early gloaming, were fertile grounds for stories and for truths that came cloaked in mist. As we close the ledger on this case, we leave you with this. In a time before forensics, when the living dared not always speak, it was the dead who found the courage, and the courts, perhaps wisely, perhaps desperately, listened. Further particulars. And now, from a ghostly case where the dead spoke plainly, to a tale where divine intervention, or perhaps a bit of Welsh mystery, said very little at all. In today's further particulars, we travel from spectral witnesses to silent saviours in a quaint and oddly touching account first published in the 1850s in Welsh for literary minds and spiritual memoirs. Picture it. A lone clergyman on horseback riding through the wild hills of rural Wales, a suspicious reaper with a sickle, a prayer whispered in desperation, and a mysterious stranger on a white horse who may or may not have galloped straight out of the clouds. Whether this story is a divine rescue or just very convenient timing, well, we'll leave that to you. Sickle-wielding men, vanishing riders, and one silent amen, all part of the public record, of course. Let's ride. From the Essayist magazine, 1853. One summer day, at the commencement of the present century, I was travelling from Bala in Monmouthshire to Maccleheath in the neighbouring county of Montgomery in order to attend a religious meeting. I left Bala at about 2 p.m. and travelled on horseback and alone. My journey lay through a wild, desolate part of the country, and one which at that time was almost uninhabited. When I had performed about half a journey, as I was emerging from a wood situated at the commencement of a long, steep decline, I observed coming towards me a man on foot. By his appearance, judging from the sickle which he carried sheathed in straw over his shoulder, he was doubtless a reaper in search of employment. As he drew near, I recognised a man who had seen at the door of the village inn of Llywelyn, where I stopped to rest my horse. On our meeting, he touched his hat and asked if I could tell him the time of day. I pulled out my watch for the purpose, noticing at the same time the peculiar look which the man cast at its heavy silver case. Nothing else, however, occurred to excite any suspicion on my part. So, wishing him a good afternoon, I continued my journey. When I had ridden about halfway down the hill, I noticed something moving, and in the same direction as myself, on the other side of a large hedge which ran nearly parallel with the road, and ultimately terminated at a gate through which I had to pass. At first I thought it an animal of some kind or other, but soon discovered by certain depressions in the hedge that it was a man running in a stooping position. I continued for a short time to watch his progress with some curiosity, but my curiosity soon changed to fear when I recognised the reaper with whom I had conversed a few minutes before, engaged in tearing off the straw band which sheathed his sickle. He hurried on until he reached the gate, and then concealed himself behind the hedge within a few yards of the road. I did not then doubt for a moment but that he had resolved to attack, perhaps murder me for the sake of my watch and whatever money I might have about me. I looked around in all directions, but not a single human being was seen. So, reining in my horse, I asked myself in much alarm what I could do. Should I turn back? No. My business was of the utmost importance to the cause for which I was journeying, and as long as there existed the faintest possibility of getting there, I could not think of returning. Should I trust to the speed of my horse and endeavour to dash by the man at full speed? If so, for the gate through which I had just passed was not open. Could I leave the road and make my way through the fields? I could not, for I was hemmed in by rocky banks or high hedges on both sides. The idea of risking a personal encounter could not be entertained for a moment. For what chance could I, weak and unarmed, have against a powerful man with a dangerous weapon in his hand? What course, then, should I pursue? I could not tell, and at length, in despair rather than in a spirit of humble trust and confidence, I bowed my head and offered up a silent prayer. This had a soothing effect upon my mind, so that, refreshed and invigorated, I proceeded anew to consider the difficulties of my position. At this juncture, my horse, growing impatient at the delay, started off. I clutched the reins, which I had let fall on his neck, for the purpose of checking him, when, happening to turn my eye, I saw to my utter astonishment that I was no longer alone. There, by my side, I beheld a horseman in a dark dress, mounted on a white steed. In intense amazement I gazed upon him. Where could he have come from? He appeared as suddenly as if he had sprung from the earth. He must have been riding behind me and have overtaken me, and yet I had not heard the slightest sound. It was mysterious and inexplicable. But the joy of being released from my perilous position soon overcame my feelings of wonder, and I began at once to address my companion. I asked him if he had seen anyone, and then described to him what had taken place, and how relieved I felt by his sudden appearance, which now removed all cause of fear. He made no reply, and on looking at his face, he seemed paying but a slight attention to my words, but continued intently gazing in the direction of the gate, now about a quarter of a mile ahead. I followed his gaze, and I saw the reaper emerge from his concealment and cut across a field to our left, resheathing his sickle as he hurried along. He had evidently seen that I was no longer alone, and had relinquished his intended attempt. All cause for alarm being gone, I once more sought to enter into conversation with my deliverer, but again without the slightest success. Not a word did he deign to give me in reply. I continued talking, however, as we rode on our way towards the gate, though I confess feeling both surprised and hurt at my companion's mysterious silence. However, and only once did I hear his voice. Having watched the figure of the reaper disappear over the brow of a neighbouring hill, I turned to my companion and said, "Can it for a moment be doubted that my prayer was heard, and that you were sent for my deliverance by the Lord?" Then it was that I thought I heard the horseman speak, and that he uttered the single word, "Amen." Not another word did he give utterance to, although I tried to elicit from him replies to my questions, both in English and Welsh. We were now approaching the gate, which I hastened to open, and having done so with my stick, I waited at the side of the road for him to pass through, but he came not. I turned my head to look. The mysterious horseman was gone. I was dumbfounded. I looked back in the direction from which we had just been riding, but though I could command a view of the road for a considerable distance, he was not to be seen. He had disappeared as mysteriously as he had come. What could have become of him? He could not have gone through the gate, nor have made his horse leap the high hedges which on both sides shut in the road. Where was he? Had I been dreaming? Was it an apparition, a spectre, which had been riding by my side for the last 10 minutes? Could it be possible that I had seen no man or horse at all, and that the vision was but a creation of my imagination? I tried hard to convince myself that this was the case, but in vain, for unless somebody had been with me, why had the reaper resheathed his murderous-looking sickle and fled? Surely no. This mysterious horseman was no creation of my brain. I had seen him. Who could he have been? I asked myself this question again and again, and then a feeling of profound awe began to creep over my soul. I remember the singular way of his first appearance, his long silence, and then again the single word to which he had given utterance. I called to mind that his reply had been elicited from him by my mentioning the name of the Lord, and that this was the single occasion on which I had done so. What could I then believe? But one thing, and that was that my prayer had indeed been heard, and that help had been given from high at a time of great danger. Full of this thought, I dismounted, and, throwing myself on my knees, I offered up a prayer of thankfulness to him who had heard my cry and found help for me in time of need. I then mounted my horse and continued my journey. But through the long years that have elapsed since that memorable summer's day, I have never for a moment wavered in my belief that in the mysterious horseman I had a special inference of providence, by which means I was delivered from a position of extreme danger. If you've enjoyed wandering these shadowy lanes with us, where ghosts name names and justice walks in strange company, we invite you to help appease the uneasy spirit of the YouTube algorithm. It is a restless thing, this modern phantom, stirred only by the ritual offerings of likes, subscriptions, and the sacred sharing with that one friend who keeps Halloween decorations up all year round. And should you wish to summon future tales from beyond the veil, stories of mystery, murder, and the uncanny, consider pressing that spectral icon known only as the hype button. It feeds on attention, it fears obscurity, and it helps keep our little parlour of the strange alive in the swirling mists of the algorithmic beyond. If tonight's tale left you peering into the past with curiosity or unease, you'll find far more within the bottomless vaults of our Patreon. There, behind creaking doors and flickering gaslight, lie hundreds of cases: Georgian jealousy, Victorian poisoners, Edwardian scandal, all ad-free, fully accessible and updated daily. For just £5 a month, less than the cost of a Victorian doctor's tonic, whether it worked or not, you gain full access to the archives, the grisly, the curious, the forgotten, and the just plain odd. One tier, one key, and endless crimes from a world where the cobblestones remembered everything. And if you'd like to walk a little deeper into the shadows, the parlour is open. Mind the draft. News of the Times. Historical crime at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, retired lantern inspector for the Ministry of Midnight Whispers, part-time archivist for the Society of Posthumous Testimony, and unofficial tea-bearer to the Spectral Justice Subcommittee. Thank you for keeping me company on tonight's damp and haunted path. Until next time, keep your cupboards shut, your candle burning low, and your wits about you. The dead have more to say.